Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is going to get pretty specific. We're going to be talking about canine neurology. More specifically, how reliably vets can assess those telltale reflexes in our furry friends.
Reflexes are such a fundamental part of the neurological exam, and this study really digs deep into how consistently vets can assess these reflexes.
You provided us with a study published in the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine, Intraobserver and interobserver agreement of 8 segmental reflexes in healthy dogs. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So to set the stage a bit, what were these researchers really trying to figure out?
They basically wanted to see which reflexes vets could most consistently agree on when examining dogs.
Okay, so why is that so important? Why do we care if vets agree on these reflexes?
Well, because accurate and consistent reflex testing can really help pinpoint potential problems in a dog's nervous system.
So it's kind of like a foundational piece of the neurological puzzle.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got a research question. What about the participants in this study? Who were they looking at?
So they had a good sample size, 101 dogs of various breeds between 1 and 10 years old.
So no puppies, no seniors, just kind of that prime-time dog population.
Exactly.
And were there any other inclusion or exclusion criteria?
Yeah, they made sure to only include dogs without any signs of orthopedic or neurological issues.
Okay, so really focusing on those healthy dogs to establish a baseline.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got our healthy dogs. Now let's get to the reflexes themselves.
Okay, so the study focused on 8 reflexes.
Okay.
4 in the front legs and 4 in the hind legs.
Okay, so let's start with the thoracic limbs. What reflexes were they looking at there?
So in the thoracic limbs, they looked at the biceps reflex, triceps, extensor, carpi radialis, and the withdrawal or flexor reflex.
Okay, so 4 pretty common reflexes that I imagine most vets are checking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what about the pelvic limbs? What were the 4 reflexes they focused on there?
So for the pelvic limb, you've got the patellar reflex, the cranial tibial reflex, the gastrocnemius reflex, and again, the withdrawal reflex.
So those are the 8 reflexes that were put to the test. So walk us through how the testing actually went down.
Okay, so they had 3 experienced veterinary neurologists independently examine each of those 101 dogs.
Okay, so 3 sets of expert eyes on each dog.
Exactly.
And what exactly were they looking for during these exams?
So they were meticulously recording whether a reflex was present or absent. So basically a positive or negative finding for each reflex.
Okay, so pretty straightforward assessment. Either the reflex is there or it's not.
Right.
Now, did each neurologist examine each dog just once?
They actually examined each dog twice, once on each side.
Okay, so controlling for any potential variability between the left and right side.
Yeah, that's important for consistency.
Absolutely. Now, I know they use some pretty specific statistical methods to measure how much these observers agreed with each other.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those a bit? How did they determine if the neurologists were on the same page when it came to assessing these reflexes?
So they used 2 main measures, the proportion of agreement and the kappa statistic.
Okay, starting with a proportion of agreement, what exactly does that tell us?
That's simply the percentage of times the observers agreed on a particular reflex.
So if they agreed on a reflex 100% of the time, that would be a perfect score.
Exactly.
But if they only agreed, say, half the time, that would be a much lower proportion of agreement.
Right.
Okay, so that's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But you mentioned they also use something called the kappa statistic.
Right, and the kappa statistic takes into account the possibility of agreement occurring just by chance.
Oh, okay, I see. So it's not just about how often they agreed, but also whether that agreement was truly meaningful or just a fluke.
Exactly. So a kappa value of 1 represents perfect agreement. 0 means there's no agreement beyond what you'd expect randomly. And negative values suggest less agreement than you'd even expect by chance.
Okay, so the higher the kappa value, the more confident we can be that the agreement between the observers is real and not just random luck.
Exactly.
Now, did they set a specific threshold for what they considered acceptable agreement in this study?
Yeah, they set a pretty high bar, actually. A reflex had to have both a proportion of agreement of at least 90% and a kappa value of at least 0.61 to be considered reliable.
Okay, so they were really looking for solid evidence that these reflexes were consistent across the different observers.
Absolutely.
So now that we've laid that groundwork, let's get to the heart of the matter. What did they find? Which reflexes emerged as the most reliable?
Well, that's what we're going to find out. Let's get into some of those specifics. I mean, the study is packed with tables and figures. They really lay out their findings.
Oh yeah, I'm a visual learner, so I love digging into those tables and figures. That's where the insights really pop for me.
So if we jump right into it, Table 1, That focuses on the interobserver agreement for observer 1, and this was one of the board-certified neurologists.
So it's basically looking at how consistently this one neurologist assessed the reflexes within their own examinations.
Exactly. So for each reflex, they examined the dog twice, once on each side, and then they compared their own findings to see how much they agreed with themselves.
Okay, so basically a self-check for consistency.
Right, and if you look at reflexes like the extensor carpi radialis, the withdrawal, the patellar, and the cranial tibial, the observed agreement percentages are really high.
Like how high are we talking?
All above 95%.
Wow, that's incredibly consistent.
Right. It shows you how meticulous and experienced these neurologists are.
And I imagine that level of consistency is important for building a strong foundation for the rest of the study.
Absolutely. And if you look at tables 2 and 3, they show the same thing for observers 2 and 3.
So all three observers were super consistent with their own assessments.
Yeah, especially for those 4 reflexes, the extensor carpi radialis, withdrawal, patellar, and cranial tibial.
Okay, so those are emerging as the front runners for reliability.
Absolutely. But now let's look at the interobserver agreement. This tells us how much the observers agreed with each other.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Are different neurologists going to come to the same conclusions about these reflexes when they're examining the same dog?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And Table 4 focuses on the agreement between Observer 1, so again, that's the board-certified neurologist, and Observer 3, who was the resident.
Okay, so comparing the experienced neurologist with the neurologist in training.
Right.
And what do we see there?
Well, those 4-star reflexes, extensor carpi radialis, withdrawal, patellar, and cranial tibial are still shining.
So those 4 are holding strong.
Yeah, they're showing agreement percentages of 92% or higher. But there's something else that's interesting here. The biceps reflex, which remember had a bit lower interobserver agreement, it's also showing some variability in the interobserver agreement.
Yeah, the kappa value is 0.66 for the left thoracic limb, which is still considered good agreement, but it's a bit lower for the right thoracic limb.
It seems like the biceps reflex might be more sensitive to the experience level of the observer. Maybe the resident found it a bit trickier to assess consistently.
Yeah, that makes sense. Experience can definitely play a role in those more nuanced assessments.
And if we keep going through the tables 5, 6, and 7, they just give us more detail on that interobserver agreement, comparing different combinations of the neurologists and the resident.
And overall, what's the main takeaway from those tables?
The same trend keeps popping up. The extensor carpi radialis, withdrawal, patellar, and cranial tibial reflexes, those show really good agreement consistently. But the biceps reflex, that one's a bit more wishy-washy.
Okay, so those 4 reflexes are really standing out as the most reliable one.
Right, and that leads to the next question, why?
Yeah, why are these specific reflexes so consistent? Did the researchers offer any insights into that?
They did. They get into the neuroanatomy and the physiology behind it all. For example, they talk about how the patellar reflex and the withdrawal reflex are like super basic protective mechanisms. They're hardwired into a dog's nervous system.
Okay, so those reflexes are so essential to a dog's survival that there's not much room for interpretation.
Exactly.
It's like a primal response. You either have it or you don't.
Right, and then they bring up this whole concept of idiomuscular responses when they're discussing the extensor carpi radialis and cranial tibial reflexes.
Okay, and what are idiomuscular responses?
Well, it basically gets into this debate about whether these reflexes are purely due to the classic reflex arc, the one with sensory and motor nerves, or if there's also a component of direct muscle stimulation involved.
So it's like there's still some mystery surrounding the exact mechanisms behind those reflexes.
Yeah, and this study kind of adds fuel to that fire.
But even with that ambiguity at the microscopic level, these reflexes are still super consistent from a clinical standpoint.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the good stuff, the strong agreement they found for those 4 reflexes, but what about limitations? Did the researchers acknowledge any limitations to their study?
Oh, for sure. Every study has limitations. They were upfront about that.
Okay, so what were some of the limitations they mentioned?
One was sample size. 101 dogs is a decent number.
Yeah, that's not small.
Right, but they acknowledge that a larger sample size, that would give them even more statistical power.
So there's always room for more data to really solidify those findings.
Absolutely. Another limitation they point out is that each observer was making their own independent interpretations of the reflexes, and that introduces a bit of subjectivity.
Yeah, even with expert neurologists, there's still that human element of perception and judgment.
Exactly. And they suggest that maybe in future studies, video recording the reflex assessments And then having multiple observers review those recordings, that could help reduce that subjectivity.
Oh, that's a great idea. It would bring in a level of standardization.
Right, and it would allow for more objective comparisons between the observers.
I like that.
They also acknowledged that. While they excluded dogs with obvious neurological issues, they didn't actually do advanced imaging like an MRI on every dog.
Oh, okay, so there's a chance that some of those dogs might have had subtle spinal lesions.
That's a possibility, and that's why it's so important to always look at the whole picture.
Right, not just rely on reflexes in isolation.
Exactly.
So those are some important limitations to keep in mind. Now, before we move on, I want to touch on the kappa statistic one more time.
Okay, yeah.
It plays such a crucial role in figuring out how reliable these reflexes are.
It does, and it's a little more complex than the simple proportion of agreement.
Can you break it down for us one more time? Like, why is the kappa statistic so important for understanding whether the agreement between the observers is actually meaningful?
Of course. So the kappa statistic, it measures the agreement between those observers, but it takes out the chance that they agreed just by luck.
Okay, so it tells us how much of the agreement is due to them being consistent with their assessments.
Right.
Versus how much might just be random.
Exactly. And remember, a kappa value of 1, that means perfect agreement. 0 means they're not agreeing any more than if they were just guessing randomly. And negative values mean they're actually agreeing less than you'd expect by chance.
Okay, that makes sense. And remember, in this study, they were looking for a kappa value of 0.61 or higher to feel good about the agreement.
Right.
So when we see those high kappa values and the high percentages of agreement,
that really strengthens the case for the reliability of those 4 reflexes.
The extensor carpi radialis, withdrawal, patellar, and cranial tibial.
Exactly.
Those are the stars of the show.
They really stand out as solid indicators of neurological function in healthy dogs.
Okay, so we've really gone deep into the methodology and the results of this study. But let's bring it back to the bigger picture. What are the implications of these findings? How does this research actually impact the way vets care for our dogs?
That is the million-dollar question. It really is, and I think this study gives us some pretty good answers.
Okay, so let's talk practical applications. How does this research actually translate into better care for our dogs?
Well, for vets out there who are examining dogs every day, this study provides some strong support for using those 4 reflexes as reliable indicators of neurological function.
The patellar, withdrawal, extensor carpi radialis, and cranial tibial.
Exactly.
So it's almost like this study gives vets an even more refined set of tools to assess those subtle neurological signs.
I like that analogy, yeah. When a vet tests those reflexes and gets consistent responses, it just gives them more confidence that the dog's nervous system is working the way it should.
And on the flip side,
yeah,
if those reflexes are absent or abnormal, that's a red flag.
Right, it tells you something's off. And you need to investigate further.
So it can really help guide the whole diagnostic process.
Exactly. It can lead to more targeted testing and ultimately more effective treatment plans.
So it's not just about knowing the reflexes. It's about understanding their reliability and how that reliability can actually inform clinical decision-making.
Absolutely.
Now, it's important to remember, this study only looked at healthy dogs.
Right.
So we need more research to see how these reflexes might be affected in dogs with different neurological conditions.
Yeah, that's a great point. A reflex that's totally normal in a healthy dog. It might mean something different in a dog with a neurological problem.
So it's all about context.
Exactly.
You have to consider the whole patient.
The history, the clinical signs, other diagnostic findings.
And then you can interpret those reflex responses. So this study is really just the beginning.
It is.
It's a great foundation, but we need to keep building on it. We need more research to really understand the complexities of canine reflexes.
Both in health and disease.
This deep dive has been fascinating. I mean, I knew reflexes were important, but I never realized just how much science goes into those seemingly simple tests that vets do.
It's a whole world in there, and there's still so much we don't know.
Well, I, for one, am grateful for the veterinary neurologists out there who are working so hard to unravel those mysteries of the canine nervous system.
They're the best. From Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.